Anytime you have an interaction with a provider, a physical therapist, a physician, someone's helping you solve some kind of medical problem, musculoskeletal problem, there are 3 questions that you should be able to answer before you walk out of that office. When I was a young first-year doc student in my DPT program, I happened to end up in an elevator with the director of the program, the dean of the school. He was an old physical therapist, and one of the things that he said is, hey, a lot of the things we're talking about can be boiled down to making sure we answer these 3 questions. And they've always served as a sort of framework for me. When I work with any client or athlete, I always ask these 3 questions after a session and make the person reflect back the best understanding of the interpretation of these 3 questions. And it really has given me a chance to make sure that the way I'm communicating is actually correctly reflected back to me, so that if I have said something that I thought was crystal clear, it sometimes doesn't come out right away with the patient as crystal clear. It also narrowed the gap between some of the errors we see in clinicians and patients, where we think that we're not in an actual relationship where we're both responsible for care. Remember, expert clinicianship is always a compromise. And I say that only in so much as I'm going to say, here's what I think is best for you, and my experience and all the worldview and the evidence, and then you're going to say, here's what I think I can do and how this is going to work into my life. And together, in a sort of relationship, we work on seeing if we can improve, resolve, solve these musculoskeletal problems in my situation. So here are the 3 questions. The first one I always ask is, do you have an understanding of what I think the problem is? And let me elaborate. It can oftentimes be more than one problem. It can be complicated. There can be biopsychosocial. It could be nutrition. It could be stress. But either way, what we've tried to do is say, hey, during this subjective and objective interview, when we're talking together, when I'm trying to get to know someone or understand, is it a movement problem, is it an environmental problem, do we have some other underlying pathology, I will always say, here's my best thinking in this moment based on what I understand. And what I want people to understand is my working hypothesis of what I think is going on, and that is going to frame what the patient is ultimately going to do, what I'm going to do in my follow-up, how I'm going to communicate around these things, what I think prognosis is, right? I'm building that, but I'm transparent with my clients and with my athletes. And more importantly, I want the person to be able to turn around afterwards and say, Kelly, what you're saying is you think I have a tendinopathy in my knee because of this. Or, hey, I have my knee pain, and in their own language, making them being able to reflect back what I think the problem is. And it's not even a diagnosis. It's just that the language of, hey, there could be multiple things going on that's causing you to experience this. How are we going to be able to sort of winnow those down or be able to kind of cross them off on the list when we're working through our plan? And one of the things that happens right away, of course, is that oftentimes patients think they have an understanding, but when you ask them to reflect back, they will have an inaccurate interpretation, which gives me an opportunity to say, hey, look, well, that's not quite right. Or, hey, if I said that, I didn't mean that. Let me reframe that for you. Or if I see confusion where someone doesn't grasp in the moment because there's a lot a patient is going through, right? They're getting to know me. They're trying to understand what's going on. They're thinking about how they're going to do this. They're worried about going back to work. So this moment of reflective sort of thinking, where a person is telling me what's happening or what I've interpreted to be their chief problem, it's a really important moment where that person then can take that information and explain it to a physical therapist. They can be a part of the triad of explaining it to a loved one or their coach. And so we just want to make sure they don't have to have a technical understanding down to the science and the details. That's why I went to grad school. Instead, we want them to have a grasp understanding. The second thing I want every patient to understand before they leave is, how long is it going to take? What is the plan? And how long is the plan going to take before I experience some change? And that change could be symptoms, that could be improved power and wattage if it's not a case of pain, that could be, some kind of other aspect of the performance or functionality that we're trying to change or improve or expand. And what I really want people to understand is this gives me an opportunity, and it gives me a mechanism by which saying, hey, look, I think as I'm working with someone, I'm going to try to manage my session in a way that I have a good understanding of how long I think we're going to see until we see progress or until we see some change. And that one is it sets this person's expectations up. Well, hey, I met with you once and I didn't get better right away, right? Or it sets it up so that people can be like, oh, you think we should be able to make some change in 2 or 3 visits? Cool. And what that means is we've set the expectations and that person knows that, hey, it may not be a one and done appointment. It may be that, hey, I think this is really complex. I think that if you manage your things on the side with my help contributing, I think we can begin to really see some systems changing or some systems re-optimizing or coming back online. And that also can align well with, hey, I see you sprained your ankle and it doesn't matter what we do, it's going to take 2 or 3 weeks for that ankle sprain to resolve itself. Or it takes this long for a tendon to heal or a bone to heal. So we can reframe that. But bottom line is the patient now understands that, hey, I'm expecting that if I do these things, I can look for this outcome. Is that placebo? Sure. Is that managing expectations? Could be. But the bottom line is that we're saying, hey, this is complex. I think we have a grip on it, but let's see what goes on in the next week and see if you're better, same, or worse, or if your symptoms change, or your experience change, or your power change, whatever language you're using that you're comfortable with. But that's a really important thing. I want patients to be able to go home and say, well, if I do these things and I follow this, the person said, my physical therapist said, hey, I should experience less swelling or less pain in this time. All right, that's number 2. And number 3 is I always want my patients to know what's next, or my athletes to know what's next. What are their next steps? And so I always say, what do you think the next steps are? Or what are the next steps? And I've already set them up for that. But oftentimes, even though I've said it, patients, again, are managing so much in the moment. They're trying to impress us. They're trying to tell their story. Oftentimes, people are being heard for the first time, right, where they're actually being listened to for a full hour because we have the luxury of having more time to do an interview and really understand some of the complex psycho-emotional, psycho-behavioral interactions that may be contributing to this person seeing me in the first place. And ultimately, when we get to that question of what's the next step, that really helps that person to know and to actually have that reflective moment where they're saying, okay, well, I'm going to need to book with you again next week, or hey, I'm going to do this exercise or this movement or this behavior change, and I'm going to work on these things. And even if it's not perfect, again, I am a big fan of, I write notes and texts and I send them, and we take pictures of what we've written on the whiteboard, and we do a lot of ways of communicating, but I want that person to have a concrete moment where they've understood that we have actually been building a treatment plan or building a training plan or some kind of behavioral change plan, expansion plan, where we know what the next steps are. The next steps for them, the next steps for me. Oftentimes, patients report that they come out of seeing a physician or a physical therapist and they go up to the front office and the person's like, okay, so what we want to book in? And the person's like, I don't know what to do. I went and saw him and I guess I don't know. So be very clear that if you can walk out of any interaction with a provider and have a clear understanding what that provider thinks the problem is. It's their hypothesis. They're an expert. That's why we're going to see them. And your advice and input is valid there too, but like we have a working hypothesis. We have an idea of how long it's going to change. Kelly, I'm really weak. Well, we're going to see some quick neuromuscular changes, but then we're going to have to squat heavy for a while, and we should see some real changes in X amount of time. If that was the weakness was the problem. And what the next steps are. How you're going to follow up with me, the additional resources required. And what we find is that, again, this was handed to me by the dean of my school in the very first week I was a physio in an elevator as kind of an offhand comment. It's really been useful for me to winnow down the discrepancies between what I think is happening in a session, working with a person, what the person think is happening, and so that we can be more clearly aligned on our therapeutic goals and our therapeutic relationship and alignment. Hopefully, you can share this with someone and you can have a better interaction because you can handle your aspect of a patient, and if you're a clinician, maybe this gives you a slightly different way of reframing how you're thinking about your patients so you can have more successful outcomes.